Welcome to Benevolent Business, the podcast exploring how to build a business that impacts society, benefiting the environment, the community, employees, and much more. Discussing with business leaders and founders how they built their business, their unique journey, and what we can all learn from their experience. Brought to you by our host, Hayden Bloomfield, and producer, David Proud.
Hello.
This week, we're joined by Benita Matofska, author of Generation Share, the perfect guest for this podcast because in her book, she has travelled the world exploring and learning, meeting business leaders and founders that have done exactly what we hope to achieve. They've built a benevolent business. They've had an impact on their community. So that's this week's guest.
Well, that sounds awesome, Hayden. But before we talk about that, you have got an electric vehicle for your business recently, haven't you?
I have, Dave.
I just want to ask you a few questions because I know a lot of businesses will be looking at this in the future, and I'm sure you're getting a lot of these questions as well. So, well, first of all, how long have you been using your electric vehicle for your business?
Got it, what are we, January now? Got it, we've had it for about 5-6 months now. We've been using it in the business.
Okay, so that's a good amount of time to sort of test how it works. So what's the sort of range of the vehicle? How long can you use it before charging up?
With regards to range, that's what a key fundamental was when I was researching all the different makes and models. So we've got a Nissan EMV200. Main focus there was its range. It's got the best, well, from what I found at the time of researching it, had the best range for the size of vehicle we were going for. Generally gets between, well, on the meter it says 170 when it's fully charged up on a good summer's day. Depending how you drive it, the key is if you're on the motorway going along at 70 miles an hour, that range will deteriorate. But if you're doing small journeys, going from job to job, so for example what we do with garden care, we're going from job to job to job to job, often in a local area, not going too far out of the way. The range is amazing, and it can last like up to a week for the team. They don't need to charge it in between, because it is just the case, it has regenerative braking. So when you're going from small job to small job, if you're just going roundabout, turn a corner, roundabout, turn a corner, then you're just charging it every time you brake. So it's fantastic for what we do. And we have a few jobs where we go sort of further afield and sit on the motorway. Yeah, you don't get the same range, but it still does the job. And we have jobs that are 30 miles away. They drive there with a fully loaded van, bear in mind, come back with an even more fully loaded van, and it is still fine. Yeah, it needs to go on charge for the next day, but it's brilliant.
That's interesting because with a fuel-powered car, it's the opposite. If you're cruising along the motorway, you're going to use a lot less petrol than you are driving through a town. Have you noticed, because it's winter at the moment, have you noticed reduced capacity in the battery because of the cold?
Yeah, definitely. So where I said about when you fully charge it, in the summer, you'll fully charge it and that meter will say 170, 165. In the winter, there's times when I fully charged it and it says 120. So it does, and obviously that's not exactly accurate. So sometimes it can be, well, often it'll be less than that. And yeah, there's definitely been times, well, the big thing as well in winter is you have the heating on. And that uses battery as well. So it's kind of a double-edged sword because it's colder, so you have less range. Plus you have to have the heating on, which uses more battery power. But again, with that, we're still able to do the same journeys, fully loaded van, go and do the jobs. We haven't had anything where we haven't been able to do a job with the van because of that.
Oh, you just stole my next question. I was going to ask if you've ever been caught short. So what about your processes for your business? Have you had to put any new processes to make sure that the vehicle's always charged, or to look at the weight of the vehicle or anything like that?
Not hugely. It's more just a case of at the end of the day, instead of the guys looking at the fuel gauge and thinking, do we need to go get fuel? And if it's something where, so I've only got a small team, so it's the kind of thing, and I've only got a few vans, so I can just run out and get fuel for the vans if needed. But obviously the only thing we're doing there is it's actually become massively more convenient because the vans come back, doesn't need to go on charge, plug it in, goes on charge overnight, sorted. Whereas with the vans running out of fuel, I then have to make sure I take that separate trip to the fuel station to go get fuel and come back, or I like the guys have a card and they'll go and fill it up for me. So it's much more convenient. It's actually made things a lot easier.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but like, let's say you said you can get 170 miles out of it on a good week, and that might last you all week. Do you know how much that will cost you in the electricity?
What will it cost? Not exactly. In complete honesty, I did the calculations in terms of looking at what it would cost to run and everything, and yeah, it works out more efficient to run it, especially if you can use renewable energies and from like solar power. But what it actually costs per mile, I don't know. And it also depends on what you charge and what tariff you're on. That can have a big thing. If you're charging at home, where you get your energy from, where you get your electricity from will have a massive impact. And if you're paying 18p per kilowatt or 20p per kilowatt, something that can have a big impact. And depending if you use different charging stations, if you use a supercharger, you'll pay a lot more. So I paid most expensive. I paid a £5 for a supercharger, and it got me half a tank, half a battery. I guess it's not half a tank anymore, but it got me half a battery.
miles.
So that's not even 100 miles exactly. But again, it depends how you're driving. But on that particular example, I was on the motorway and drove home, so it's ran short.
I don't know though, because I'm thinking like to fill up my petrol tank, or diesel tank, it's about £60, and that will last me about 400 miles. So really, at £5 ain't that bad.
No, exactly. It's not. And given that's using the most expensive method of filling up. So, and that was I caught short. That was the time that I was caught short. So one of the other biggest questions people have is always, oh yeah, but charging infrastructure is not there. There's no network of charging points, so you're going to be cut short. And the one time that I was cut short, I was going home and I knew I could get home. I just needed to avoid the M25, but my phone sat-nav was playing up and wasn't giving me a road direction to go home, which is definitely something they're going to have to change about sat-navs. The way they work when we all move to EVs is have a road option, motorway option, because that'll be the biggest fundamental in whether or not you'll make it to your destination. So I was in that.
There is an option on Waze for that.
Oh, is there?
Yeah, avoid motorways.
I need to get that, because that would be a big help, because I was in a situation where I needed to get home via the road and it was just taking me onto the M25 and I was coming up to M25 thinking, bugger, I'm not going to make it home. And I was then like turning around trying to work out what to do, trying to find out and guess the roadway, and I got down to like 10 miles and I was like, I'm just going to pull in this car park and like see if I can get recovered or something. I pulled into the car park and I was like, oh, there's a charging point, there's a fast charger. Charged it up and there you go, went home. And there was another time when I was driving home and the sat-nav was taking me on a diversion to go this roadway, and I was like, no, what's it on about? It's like 10, 11 o'clock at night, there's no traffic, I'll just go from the M25 to the A2, 10 minutes home. Then I realised why the sat-nav was taking me on a diversion. I saw the A2 and it was just a standstill. I literally would have just parked up. So I was like, no, I'll go, carry on. I know if I keep going to the next exit, I can go some other route. Didn't realise that adds like 20 miles to the journey. So it was like M25, M20. So I'm in an EV where I haven't got that kind of range, and I only got, I think I was going along the motorway and it flatlined, and I was like 12 miles from home, thinking, and this is like pitch black at night. I then from there was pretty much a country lane all the way to my town in Gravesend, more or less, and I was then sort of home. So I had 12 miles to go and it had flatlined. I got all the way home and got into my close, and as I got to like the last minute of my journey, obviously I was trying to be as eco as I could. So I was like, windows up, like turn all the heating off, like, and trying to think, how can I drive to get the most out of the battery? And then as I had the last minute of my journey, I was like, I'm really impressed by this. I was like, I'll stick the heating on, full blast, and I'll warm myself up for the last minute as I turn into my close. I got turned into my close and then pulled up and stopped, and I just had to pull on the driveway. I literally broke down there on the driveway. I like went to pull up on the driveway, and where it's like the slope path, it just died and rolled back.
I like to think of it like an 80s film. So like you're driving and it just goes like that, and you're done.
Well, you get like limp mode, so because you have with the accelerator, it goes so far down and it stops, and then you can push it further, and it's like it stops doing that. Obviously, when the battery goes low, you can only get that like reduced acceleration, and then you just gradually get slower and slower. But I wouldn't call it limp mode, because you're still able to drive normally. You're just not able to like floor it. But yeah, I was just driving, and all of a sudden, after 12 miles, it just went.
I mean, do you see it as being like fairly powerful because it hasn't got gears and stuff? It's like direct drive.
So much more powerful.
Huh.
No, you put it on eco. It has eco mode, but if you take it off of eco mode and you just floor it, bear in mind it's a work van. It's like when I compare it to like my Caddy that's diesel. The Caddy's like, and is a bit tickles along, whereas the EV, you floor that and you know you're going. Yeah, it's got instant torque because it's a battery.
Yeah,
or a motor.
That's really good. I'm probably looking at getting an EV for my next vehicle, but I'd want something like an estate or something like that, so I can pack on my gear in the back. I guess the only other thing you could do, I'm going to put this idea in your head, to make it a bit more environmentally friendly, is to stick some solar panels in your new yard, so then you could charge up there.
Oh, that's the dream. Like, there's a lot of roof space. So, I mean, my eventual dream with the company is to have a completely self-sustained, self-contained HQ that is all renewable energy. So we have solar panels that generate energy. The only thing is, with that many electric vans, is you'd have to generate a lot. It would almost be a power plant if I wanted to charge all of them from my own source. But that would be the ultimate goal, is have all this renewable energy that goes through, so that we're not actually having any detriment to the environment whatsoever.
One day.
So
I've got one last question for you. What is the driving experience compared to a fuel car?
Incredible. So when I think of, obviously I'm driving vans a lot of the time. So the things that I found annoying about a van was it just stunk of diesel, and like the fumes. Well, they're not old diesel vans, but they're still a diesel van at the end of the day. So with an electric, you haven't got that sort of horrible scent every now and then. And also, just in terms of driving experience, just the silence of it. Like, you pull away and it's just, and that's it. And that's you flooring it. It's so peaceful, so tranquil. It is really pleasant. And I mean, well, again, I'm going back to, I'm driving like an old diesel. I'm driving diesel van, so they've got gears. Whereas instead, it's just, obviously it's electric motor, so there's no gears. It's got cruise control, which my other vans haven't. So it's very pleasant. Whereas if you've got a nice modern car, I suppose it's not. Yeah, it's a blessing. I do like it. Stops you speeding as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's amazing. You're driving down the street and all you can hear, the loudest component of the journey, is just the tyres going along the road. There's no engine noise. It's just this peaceful silence.
Yeah,
tranquility.
I guess that's like a lot less mentally draining. I remember when I moved up to my Golf, and it's a lot more insulated, and I got cruise control and things like that. So I ended up finishing journeys and feeling a lot more mentally awake. Do you feel that?
Yeah, definitely. Especially with the Nissan, I think where I'm used to driving diesel vans, they're not renowned for their comfort. They're not renowned for driver or user experience. Whereas this is something that, it's not like driving a van. It's like being in a nice car. As you said, like when you talk about cruise control, it's got cruise control. It's got air conditioning, it's pleasant. The interior of it's, I'd say, more sort of similar to a car. It's got like nice fabric seats, it's got carpet, it's got like rubber mat, but it is a very pleasant experience. But yeah, when you think of that sound of the engine roaring and just the general smell, like even with petrols or nice diesel cars, you still get the smell of fumes every now and then. And when you pull up to a petrol station, which I don't have to do anymore, well, not in that one, but it is a much nicer user experience in terms of just that peacefulness.
So I guess the big takeaway is, if you're a business, don't be afraid of an electric vehicle. It can actually work for your business, and it might actually be better actually for you in the long run.
So here we go. Benevolent Business, Benita Matofska. Benita, welcome.
Great to be here.
Thank you for coming on. So to jump straight in, normally the first question is just give us 30 seconds off the wall, tell us about your company. But with you, where your journey is, your whole sort of existence is benevolence. So can you give us a quick snippet into the different things that you're involved in right now?
Well, I'm a speaker, international speaker, a change maker. I'm the author of a book called Generation Share, which is a book about change makers from around the world who've developed all sorts of innovative, socially impactful business models. And I also am the founder of The People Who Share, which is a social enterprise. And we are all about enabling people in need to be able to access shared resources, making those resources available for people and to protect the planet.
Two charities there, a book, and glad you mentioned the book. It's something I really want to come on to, because from when we had a conversation the other week, there was just so many things you pointed out there that just blew my mind with what one book can achieve. But before we get into that, I really want to get to know a bit more about you and how this journey came, or how you came on this journey. So like, we talked to a lot of business leaders, business owners, where they've sort of been in business, owned a business. But your background, you started off, you've been employed, you've worked for a company. So can you give us a little bit of background of where your journey took you there?
Well, I started out in broadcasting. I worked in the wonderful world of the media for over 20 years, and I worked for the BBC. I was a BBC journalist, working first in radio, then in television, and producing documentaries, factual programmes, travel programmes, various series. I moved to New York, where I had my own production company, Suitcase Productions, and again producing factual programmes and documentaries, mostly for the Discovery family of channels. And I also worked for the BBC in New York. I moved back to the UK. I worked for a couple of other large production companies based here in Brighton, where I live. And after, let's say, looking back to sort of 2007, 2008, I reached a point where I just was ready for a change. I was getting quite fed up of the very reductive nature of television and factual programming at that time. And I wanted to be more impactful. I wanted to give back. I wanted to be more involved in something that would benefit people and planet. And so I left and I went to work in the charity sector, and I was head of global entrepreneurship at Enterprise UK, which was, my role was very much about leading a worldwide movement of entrepreneurial young people, really inspiring and equipping young people to have ideas and make them happen, but with a big focus on social entrepreneurship. And it was during that time that, because of my title, head of global entrepreneurship, which my friends used to joke sounded like head of the world, that I was invited to some, to give awards and just some extraordinary opportunities, really. And the most humbling of which was I found myself sharing a platform with none other than Desmond Tutu at the One Young World Congress. And that was just a really extraordinary moment for me. That was back in March 2010. And Bob Geldof was also there. I'd been asked to be what was called a counsellor, a sort of mentor for young people. And when I'd asked, who else have you got, in my very TV way, I was told, we've got Desmond Tutu and Bob Geldof. So I knew I was in pretty good company. But actually, joking aside, it was a really humbling experience. And for me, that was a moment of realisation that actually what I wanted to do was to launch a campaign, launch a social enterprise that was really about being at the forefront, being about much more of an activist and actually making a big difference in the world. And I've long believed in the power of business to do good. I think that, many of us work in lots of different environments. Some of us might be entrepreneurs, we might work for a company, or we might be very entrepreneurial. But no matter what we're doing, we might be working on a community project, we have the opportunity to make a difference and to give back to people and planet. And for me, that's really my driver. My driver is all about, how can we share resources? How can we make things better? At the moment, there's huge opportunities with COVID-19 to build back better. And that's really the focus of my current work. But I've become, over the years, really fascinated by this whole idea of change makers. Who are these entrepreneurial people, these social entrepreneurs, these innovators, who, despite the odds, sometimes they're working, against incredible odds, find ways to make change in their communities and inspire others and change laws and, tackle all kinds of really difficult obstacles that they come across, and actually they really make a difference to people's lives. So for me, that really is the driver.
That's extraordinary philosophy to have, and I completely agree with you there. So to rewind, where you said about your background's in media, and then obviously you've completely flipped and gone on this journey, and you mentioned some of the sort of experiences you had in media. So was that something that inspired, because I'm trying to understand where media has, I guess, a bit of a stigma around it's not the most positive industry always. So how does someone that's in media go from that to then becoming part of this global change making and really changing the way we can all think of how we use resources? Where was that journey? Was it a bad experience in media, or was it something that opened your eyes to other opportunities?
Well, actually, the reason that I went into the media was because I've always been interested in this idea of telling human stories and how can we tell impactful stories to make change. I grew up in a family environment. My parents were very involved in community work, in charity work, and from a really young age, I was raising money for causes, doing jumble sales, and all sorts of things with my friends. Used to organise something called the Santa Sack at Christmas time, where you would ask people as they went into the supermarket, could they donate buy an extra can of food or an extra item to help those in need, those people that were going hungry. And so, this whole idea of really caring about other people and being a sort of caring, sharing person is something that has been with me throughout my life, and really very much the environment and the community that I grew up in Leeds. And so, for me, journalism was really a way to express that. And, my years in the media were, I had an extraordinary time, and I made some, documentaries and some programming that I'm really proud of, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to be able to tell stories of value. And so many times commissioners would say to me, oh, well, that's too worthy, Benita. And it's like, what, something's too worthwhile to actually tell that story, and that just was something that just never made any sense to me. And so, I think, look, the media is incredibly powerful. We know that, and there are there's good media and there's bad media and there's plenty in between, and you can find all sorts. For me, it was about saying, actually, this is not the industry where I'm going to have the biggest impact. And I did have some negative experiences in television, just trying to get programs of value commissioned, and even once having got them commissioned and successfully broadcast, produced and broadcast, again, just the challenges that went around that, and the constant idea that we're going to make something really sort of reductive or car crash television, and it just really wasn't the environment that I wanted to be in. So for me, it was about saying, well, actually, I can take all these communication skills that I have and I can do something with that. And for me, most of what I do is public speaking. I'm very much interested in how I can influence others, how I can help and support businesses. I work with all kinds of businesses to help them through what I've developed as a change maker process, because I believe all businesses have the opportunity to do something positive. And actually, we're now in an environment where it's a necessity. Businesses can no longer only focus on commercial value. They need to be creating social and environmental value. And that's been the case for some time. That said, the coronavirus crisis has actually really brought that to the fore, and that, combined with the climate crisis, has created this perfect storm where businesses now need to build back better. We've got an opportunity to reset. We've got an opportunity to recharge. We've got an opportunity to create something that is better than what was previously. And also, businesses have to find a way of being sustainable. And one of the ways that you can be sustainable, very simply, is by putting, the social and the environmental at the heart of what you're doing. Are you creating something that is needed by people, that is human shaped? Are you creating something that is going to benefit the planet? Because if it is, then it's much more likely to last. So I think once businesses understand this context of being socially entrepreneurial and being conscious and responsible businesses, that this is related to their survival, then it gives it a very, very different potential for an outcome, a positive outcome.
Two things I really want to know from this. So you talked about your transition going from the media and sort of seeing your potential there. There was other avenues you could go down where you could really explore your potential and help the world. So with that, did you find your transition out of media? So you said there were bad experiences and then you realised what you wanted to do, so you've changed your path. Through that transition, did you find that when you approached your colleagues, your bosses, was this something that they were supportive of, or was it something where they sort of thought you were crazy?
Well, initially, when I made the move from the charity sector, when I decided to leave Enterprise UK, so following that experience that I had at the One Young World Congress, where I was inspired by what Desmond Tutu was talking about, and I was determined to really be much more on the front line making a difference, I left that session and that event really feeling like I wanted to do something much more positive. And the word that would not leave me was the word sharing. Sharing. And I woke up one morning and the first thought that came into my head was, what's wrong with the world is there's a shortage of sharing. And I then went on to think, well, actually, we can fix that, because our planetary resources may be finite, but we each have an unlimited capacity to share. And if we can unleash that, then there's no end to what we can achieve. And I sort of got very excited about this whole idea of a sharing economy. And at that time, this is a decade ago, this term was something that wasn't really being used. And so I started talking about sharing economy, building a sharing economy. I launched a social enterprise, a non-profit called The People Who Share. And I went off on this mission to inspire people to be sharing in their communities and sharing resources, and to find different ways in which that could happen, whether that was using technology or whether that was, through experiences in communities. And yes, in the beginning, people did think I was crazy, and I sort of believe that, it often is the case that, people who are campaigners, who stand up for issues, who are really going against the current, are initially considered to be lunatics, and that's okay, because you're challenging the system, you're challenging the status quo, and that's something that needs to be challenged, and that still remains to be the case. Over the years, of course, the sharing economy has grown. Last year, with the launch of my book, Generation Share, that was published to celebrate a decade of the sharing economy and the start of Global Sharing Week, which is an initiative I started through the People Who Share. And so, over time, of course, what's happened is that, we've become familiar with these terms, and, we start to understand. And of course, with the climate crisis and all of the visibility around that, and, Greta Thunberg and, all of her campaigning and Youth for Climate, these issues have really come to the fore. And 2020, with the coronavirus crisis, what we've seen is that people have had to really re-examine, their lives. They've had to really reconsider so many things, because choices were taken away from us. The world was in lockdown at various different stages, and we've really had to reimagine how we live, the things that we do, the choices we make, when choices were so limited. And it's given people an opportunity to really think about, what do they want to do with their lives, whether that's to do with how they're running their businesses, whether that's to do with their family relationships. Everything has been really up in the air and up for grabs to that in that respect. And there's something about having that opportunity to just stop. Things were going at the kind of pace where, people were, the whole idea of kind of hyper consumption and some of the crazy decisions that, people have been making. We've been on a trajectory that is completely unsustainable. And so having that opportunity to take that time to stop and to consider everything that we're doing is really a good thing. And, we've seen some positives come out of this crisis. Of course, there's been a horrendous loss of life, and that is absolutely tragic. What we have seen, of course, is that, the planet for a period of time was able to breathe at a time when tragically humans couldn't. We saw traffic in the UK reduced to levels of 1955. We saw a 95% reduction in air traffic. It was wonderful to go down to Brighton seafront and not have any pollution trails. Clear skies. It's no coincidence that the weather has been beautiful during lockdown. But what that did for me was it said, well, actually, we have this power, we have this potential to reverse climate change. And I don't know that before this crisis, I don't think I felt so certain about that. But actually, this really, for me, gave me that concept, that actually that evidence that, we can do something about this. And by changing our consumption habits, by changing the way that we run our businesses, by changing the dynamics, the way that we treat other people, we had the biggest volunteer effort since the Second World War. Communities, through up and down, the length and breadth of the country were coming together. Obviously the community clapping that we had for the NHS. I mean, there's some extraordinary, activities happening. I started a blog called Love in the Time of Corona at the beginning of the crisis, and the idea was to collect these positive stories that were happening during the crisis. And I just had so many. I was absolutely inundated because there was so many things that were happening. And what I was starting to see was this kind of pandemic of kindness. Now, it's true to say, of course, that as time has gone on, things are changing. Some people are starting to try to kind of find a way of reverting back to normal and to how things were before. But then are starting to realise that transition is just not possible, and things can't go back to the way they were for lots of different reasons. Some of those are quite technical reasons. But at the same time, it's given that opportunity for people to really reconsider and to really consider what they're doing. And I think, from a point of view of, the food industry, for example, and, this whole idea of, key workers and people working in the food industry, for example, and the importance of that and supply chains, and actually really considering, well, do I need that item of food? Can I make something out of what I already have in my cupboards? And we heard all sorts of, kind of lockdown recipes and all the rest of it. But, I think it is really interesting that people were really having to ask themselves, if you're only going out once a day and you really only need to be going out for something that you need, then you ask yourself that question, do I actually need to go and buy something? And if the answer is no, then you're not doing that. added to the fact, of course, of, financial insecurity and people not being, certain about what was happening in terms of employment and, other sort of financing. So I think it has been a really interesting time where things have been completely turned on their head, and it's given that opportunity to really re-examine, what we're doing and how we're doing it.
I would totally agree. It's been it's been the craziest year for all of us, I think. And as you said, Benita, there's been some incredible opportunities to learn here and just see what we're doing that's so destructive, and also what we can all learn and take away from this. And on the subject of that, so you mentioned your blog, Loving the Time of Corona. So how, through this year, how is, obviously as a public speaker, that's really have got to have impacted you there. So how have you seen yourself, your own industry impacted, and you talk a lot about sharing. So how have you continued to share your lessons, your journey? So what have you changed, and how have you continued sharing?
The experiences industry, the event industry has been, completely shattered. I had events, lined up through the year. And, starting at the beginning of March, of course, they were cancelled. Some were postponed. Some people were like, okay, well, an event that was supposed to be happening in March where I was booked to speak, we're rebooking you for June, we're rebooking you for July, we're rebooking you for August. Actually, we're going to rebook you for October. And then people start to realise, actually, this is probably a next year thing, and even then we're not so sure. But again, I think that's been a really interesting opportunity for the events industry, because we've had increasingly over the years with increasing capacity and innovation in technology, this ability to be able to join events from the other side of the world, and I believe that the industry is going to come out stronger as a result. So in the beginning, I've been doing lots of online, summits and webinars and so on. And, in the beginning, there was definitely sort of reticence for that. People certainly felt that they didn't really want to pay for that. The irony, of course, as a speaker, when you're doing something online, you actually have to do far more work, because it's very different when you're physically in a room with people and you can make that eye contact. It's very, very different. But when you're online, you have to find different ways of engaging people, and you have to work so much harder. And also you have to give people different kinds of, you have to give them value for money, of course, but you have to do a lot more work. And that might be around, before the event itself, those conversations that you might have. It might be to do with follow-up. It might be other materials that you're providing. But as a speaker, you have to work so much harder. Ultimately, I believe that, this is going to be really the making of that experiences industry, because I think as we start to see the emergence of physical events again, they will have those online elements. They will have those virtual aspects to them. They will be much more innovative, and they will be delivered in a much more participatory way. And as someone who's very passionate about sharing and the sharing economy and engaging the crowd, I think that gives people all kinds of opportunities. So rather than this sense of being at the podium and being the great I am speaker that's the expert, and this very kind of hierarchical approach, actually the idea that it's much more of a kind of democratic approach, it's much more of a crowd approach that people can engage and participate. I think that's a positive thing. And I think what we're starting to see is that event organizers, clients are starting to understand that this is something worth paying for, that these speakers are actually giving incredible value for money, and that there's so much work and there's so much more to get from it for clients, for businesses, which actually can really help them in their businesses. The work that I do is very much about not just inspiring businesses to consider how they're going to become change maker companies and build back better, but actually taking them through a process. And I work with businesses, over each month, and take them through a 12-stage process to become a change maker company. So rather than this idea of simply delivering a keynote and people go away and they're all very inspired and that's fantastic, actually it's okay, well, how can we take people through a process that is genuinely impactful, that's really going to make a difference to their business in very, very practical terms. And so I think that those speakers who really are focusing on purpose and impact are really coming to the fore, and I think that's really exciting. in a way that, this whole idea of business purpose was a term that was being kind of touted, and, mission-driven businesses were, these were terms that people were throwing around. But now I think it's becoming much more concrete, that people realise this is something that they need to do. And so they want to find those experts that can help them through a process to do that. So for me, it's actually a very exciting time in that respect, with lots of opportunities ahead.
So you've mentioned that obviously for you in speaking, it's all gone virtual now, obviously, and the challenge is there in terms of still providing that value. And you said like the amount of it, because that never occurred to me in I suppose in my inexperience in my head, it was just, as a public speaker, you're on a screen now, you just sit down, get up, have a cup of coffee, and you just talk there. Whereas obviously, as you're saying, from first experience, it's actually a lot more work. So my question
I might
there
sometimes still have a cup of coffee though, I have to say, occasionally, as long as it's decaf, mind you, then it's okay.
So with all these changes, and that's just completely disrupted an industry. So with the team you're working with, how have you found that experience as a team, and how has it been has it been quite a tumultuous time? Has it been difficult, or have you all sort of gotten with each other and got each other's backs up and been like, come on, we can do this? Because it's obviously going to big events, it's what you're doing there compared to being on a screen at home. Is the team different? Is it the same? And how have you all supported each other there?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, even the word team is interesting from my perspective, because I work in partnership with lots of different organisations and individuals. So, I haven't been working in a very traditional sense, structure where, I have a team of people and we go into an office every day. I haven't done that for years. When I do go into a physical office, it would have been a co-working space, for a particular purpose. But, so I've been remote working for years, and there's a lot of travel involved in the work that I do. So I'm very often, prior to this year, I have to add, very often not been at home as such. So I've been working from other places. And so my team as such, is constantly changing, and, different partnerships, different people, and they've always been in different parts of the world. So, for me, using Zoom and, other platforms, is something that I have been doing for years, because that's the very nature of, the fact that if I've got, somebody in South Africa, I've got, somebody in the Netherlands, I've got, somebody, in San Francisco, then this is how we're going to be communicating and managing that. And I think that there's lots of efficiencies that come with that, because obviously what you don't have is that kind of that sort of day-to-day, bumping into people, as you're making a cup of coffee. You don't have that as such. But what you do have is you have something that becomes much more efficient, because, and again, I think we've seen throughout this pandemic, people working from home, that there's a lot more efficiencies in working, because we get screen fatigue, don't we? So you only want to be, if you're having a Zoom call, you're going to get through those items. You're going to be focused. There's going to be a lot less kind of, sort of waffle and time wasted, because people actually just want to get the job done. So I think that's been, from an efficiency point of view, I think that's really interesting. I also think it's really interesting from a relationship point of view, because, what we've seen, is that families, for example, have communicated much more frequently. So, I look at my own family. My father's and my mother have both been ill during, not with COVID, but during, the crisis, and that's been difficult. They live in Leeds, I'm in Brighton, but, I speak to them several times a day. So we'll FaceTime, we'll have a WhatsApp video call. Sometimes we've been doing family Zoom quizzes and those kinds of things. But actually the communication has been a lot more frequent. And I think that's quite interesting, and that is across the board. When I looked at some of the sort of data around it, and it definitely showed that people are communicating a lot more frequently, and rather than perhaps making a call, they're making it. They're on WhatsApp, they're on FaceTime, they're on Zoom, so they're actually having that that kind of visual connection with people. So I think that's interesting from a relationship point of view. I also think the other thing that kind of happens is that, and I found that, as I mentioned, I've always had this very sort of diverse, kind of remote team, so to speak, in different places. But I think also the screen gives us this opportunity. It's something in a way to kind of hide behind. And And it gives you the opportunity to perhaps to reach out to new partners, new potential, colleagues, to develop new business relationships in a way that we might not have done before. And I have found that people have been really receptive to that. I mean, I'm just looking at LinkedIn, for example, and I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and I use it a lot for business, for my book, for campaigning. It's been a really useful tool. But I've definitely noticed, during the pandemic that, so many invites on LinkedIn. And I think people really have used it as a time to really reach out to people. And that's a positive thing. What comes of those connections? Well, I suppose that depends on the opportunities that you take or make. But I think that's quite interesting. So look, we are fortunate that we're living in an era where we have this technology, where that has been possible, where, during a pandemic when schools are closed down, they were able to go online. They were able to we've been able to deliver things in a different way virtually. But what I also think it does is it makes us really think about the longer term and how we blend and how we sort of utilize both the online and the offline in combination together. Because there's absolutely, I can't say this enough, the experiences, the physical experiences, the kind of interactions of physically being present. There is a magic around that that technology can't replace. But what it can do is it can enhance it. And I think that's really the interesting part of it, that we can be so much more creative and imaginative, in the way that we envisage, how we're going to deliver these things. And rather than thinking about, this whole idea of sort of co-creating things and collaborating and working together, to create something that is a lot more engaging and interactive than it's ever been before. And I think that has huge value. The other thing is that, from a kind of freelance perspective and a remote working perspective, to a certain degree, the remote workers that have been, doing this for a long time, for years and years and years, have sort of had the last laugh, because actually all of this kind of pushback that you may previously have had from employers about not wanting people to work from home because they're going to be messing about, they're not going to get stuff done, they're going to be off doing other things, all of the distractions, actually has proven the opposite, has proven to be true. And so I think that's really interesting, because what you start to have is this real sense of the kind of work-life balance. And there's something very human about the fact that, somebody's doing an interview and, the dog walks in, or, whatever, there's, a child comes to ask you a question or something like that. And it's just a lot more human, isn't it? It's much more real. This is how we live our lives. And actually being able to, rather than spending, 2 hours commuting, or, 4 hours a day commuting, we're actually able to use that time to get a much better balance, a much happier balance. So I think there are lots of aspects lots of lessons that we can learn from all of this. And again, employers, because they've had no choice, I know today, things are changing again, and there's an encouragement to work from home, to work remotely. Well, there are lots of positives in that, and I think we need to look to that. Work has been changing over the last decade immensely. My book, I have a chapter which is looking at the future of work, and obviously that was from the vantage point of a few years ago. And the book, as I mentioned, it was published last year, but I was collecting the research for that from 2016, and looking at how just work and attitudes towards work is changing. And this whole idea of how, work needs to be human shaped. And actually there are so many benefits to that. There are commercial benefits to that. When people are happier and healthier at work, and they start to feel valued, when you start to look at, how you treat employees in a more human way, and people start to they will inherently, you're going to stay at a company for a much longer duration if you feel valued, and you have more input, you have more opportunity, and you have much more responsibility. So I think we've seen that shift to this sort of, this culture of responsibility. I think that's really exciting. I think one of the things that's going to be sort of quite interesting is to see how co-working spaces reinvent themselves. And of course, we're already seeing the introduction of different ways of being COVID safe in these spaces, with different screens, so people can be a bit more partitioned, but at the same time, having an environment where people people can, connect. I think that's going to be quite interesting. And I think that's one of the, the sectors that, I really feel like the co-working spaces and that sector was really taking off. And obviously that has been, hard hit. But I think ultimately, what we're going to see is a kind of blend of these different ways of working, depending on what really works for you and your particular set of circumstances. And I think that can only be a positive thing, really.
I really want to come onto your book, but I've got one last question before we come on to that. So you mentioned there about the whole industry, how it's all changing, adapting, evolving. So you've mentioned obviously a lot of benefits there where communities, families, just strangers in general, we're all becoming a bit, in certain aspects, in a lot of aspects, we're all becoming friendlier. We want to do more to help out. We've become more aware of the problems that we're all facing, especially now we've all had our lives changed overnight. So with your industry, how do you see that now developing? You've mentioned some of the changes you've had to make and obviously adapting to being online. But when we start to go back, if we do go to an environment where we're allowed to go into rooms and be within close proximity, how do you see your industry, or what do you want from your industry in the future in terms of public speaking and doing in the event sector? How do you want to see it progress, and how do you want to see it become better as a result of this?
From a sustainability perspective, I've long had this concern. I would be booked as a sustainability speaker. I turn up at an event, and what do I see? I see there's no recycling. There's huge amounts of waste. The event itself has just not been put together in any kind of sustainable way. And for me, that made no sense whatsoever. Equally, this whole idea of flying people, across the world for a day, for a 24-hour period to be flown back again, doesn't make any sense either. And so, I believe that what we're going to see is events where, speakers, I believe, will be that are physically in the room, will be much more locally based or nationally based in that particular country. So I think people are going to be flying less to events, but they will be joining them online. And I think that's a real positive. So you'll still have a global event, you'll still have your international audience. It's just that you won't be, consuming the tons of carbon that you previously were. And that's got to be a good thing. I also think that what will be happening is, so from a sustainability point of view, I think that's an absolute plus. I also think people are really sort of looking at their supply chains, they're looking at, the kind of waste that is part and parcel of some of these events, and the kinds of things that you provide for people. I mean, the whole kind of, goodie bags. I mean, honestly, how many of those bags do you receive every single year? I mean, I speak at, lots and lots of events, and of course, they give you a goodie bag and they give you a speaker bag and they give you other things as well. And, I could just go home with a suitcase full of absolute crap that I just have no use for. That makes no sense whatsoever. I tend to refuse this stuff, typically, is what I do. But I think that this period has really enabled people to kind of reconsider those things. Again, it's this question of, what do I actually need? Is there a shared resource that I can tap into? What is it that people would find genuinely useful? It's not a load of tat, shoved in a plastic bag, that's for sure. So, I think that things are going to be really reconsidered from a sustainability perspective. But I also think from a business perspective, it's going to be very different. I think, there's a much stronger business case for, how we view events, how we deliver events, how we connect with people. I think there will be, a lot more online events that are happening. We're already seeing that. People are becoming used to this idea that, events can be professional and they can be online. People are using studios to produce these events. So they're producing these kind of high-tech online experiences that are really giving people an experience. And I think that's something that we're going to see progressing. I think there'll be all kinds of use of, virtual reality. I just think there's going to be a much more kind of creative and imaginative ways in which these experiences and these environments will happen. And I think that's really exciting. So I'm really excited about what will happen. I also think that, from a kind of social point of view and from a networking point of view, again, that's going to be different, but there are going to be different kinds of opportunities. And, the other thing that I've seen is with some of the events that I've participated in, that whilst I might have been asked to do what would have traditionally been a keynote, there's been a lot more in terms of an additional workshop session where something goes deeper in these smaller groups, where there's that opportunity to really get to know people or get to understand their businesses. So, when I work with businesses, a lot of the work that I'm doing to take them through this change maker process is to really look at the very particulars of their particular sector and industry and their set of circumstances. Well, I can't really do that if I'm speaking to 2,000 people, but if I'm doing a workshop and there are 15 people on an online workshop, in that particular session, then I've got an opportunity to really look at the specifics of those different businesses and have much more of an impact. So I think there's something about how that's happening and how these kinds of experiences are being delivered that are much more valuable, that are a lot less disposable and a lot less superficial, and they're much more relevant. Actually, they're more relevant, they're more authentic, and that has to be a positive thing.
I love your honesty there. I know I completely agree. In terms of some of the freebie stuff you get, you just think, where is this going to end up other than a lot of people's bins? And I think it's a good point to raise, and I certainly hope you're right there in terms of events becoming much more sustainable, whether they are all virtual as we come back into a face-to-face environment, but becoming more sustainable, more around looking at supply chains, who's local, how can we be more environmentally friendly with this, and also I love the way that you still found a way to share so much, despite the fact we're all closed in. There's still so much sharing going on, and that's exactly where I want to come on to Generation Share. So obviously, you mentioned a year now your book's been out, and research began 2016. You said, take me on the journey there of was it waking up one day going, right, I'm going to write a book, or was it something that's for years you're sort of thinking, got to write a book? How did that all begin?
So I've always been passionate about reading and writing. I did an English literature and language degree, and that's something that I started out as a journalist. So writing is always something that I've always loved and always done, and this passion, as I mentioned previously, to tell stories, tell powerful stories, tell human stories, people stories, to bring those to public attention was definitely a big driver behind Generation Share. I suppose that I had the idea for the book probably about 10 years ago when I first started on this sharing economy journey. I was just seeing all these incredible people and really interested in how people were able to set up these different initiatives and have impact in their communities, and this whole idea of what makes a change maker is something that sort of emerged over a number of years. So I'd say I probably had the idea for Generation Share about a decade ago, but it's one thing to have an idea and it's another thing to actually put that into practice. And in 2016 I decided I was ready to make this a reality. And I invited Sophie Scheinwald, who is a phenomenal photographer, to join me on this journey, because what I didn't want to do was to write or to produce yet another academic book about the sharing economy. And actually, that's something that's been done already. It really wasn't my place to do that. What I wanted to do is to bring very personal stories, human stories of change makers, so that people could connect with this. And the sort of result is the book Generation Share, and it's in some ways you could say it's a coffee table book, but the idea was, through powerful photography, was to really bring these human stories to public attention so people could connect with them and find something of themselves in those very, very human stories. I have this sort of belief that inside everyone there's a change maker. We all have the power to make change and make a difference. It's about how can we unleash that? What's the spark that leads to that? The people in the book are people who've at some point they've had this impetus, they've had this spark, they've had something that's kind of ignited them to really make their concept a reality and make changes in their environments. So for me it was very much about bringing that to public attention. But I wanted to do this in a sustainable way. I've been working in this space for a long time. The idea of shared resources, everything that I wear is pre-loved or vintage, whatever you want to call it. But, I'm a real believer in that, we have enough resources in the world to feed and clothe everybody who needs to be fed and clothed. We have enough housing to house the global population 10 times over. There is no need for hunger and homelessness. We have everything we need. We have the resources. What we aren't doing enough of is we're not sharing those in any kind of equitable way. And so, it really is, even if you just look at surplus and wasted resources, if we were to divert that to people, food, for example, that's, a third of our food is wasted. A third of our food is wasted. We could feed everybody. There's no need for hunger worldwide. We have enough with the surplus that people are throwing away without even thinking about it. We have enough perfectly good food to feed everyone that needs to be fed. And so, for me to put a product out there in the world, the book itself had to be sustainably sourced and ethically created and produced. And I was fortunate through my LinkedIn network to be connected to find a literary agent who connected me to Policy Press and to Ali Shaw and the Bristol-based team at Policy Press. And they are, Policy Press is an imprint of Bristol University Press. They publish books about social change. And I knew that this was the right home for this book and this concept. And that, I wanted to do something that actually really did have resonance. And, there's sort of very thorough research behind this book, evidencing, how, people are sharing in their communities and how they're making these changes, and why this idea of a more sustainable economy is something that can happen, and that we've got all these very credible opportunities. And so the book itself is made from 100% waste. Every single copy feeds and educates a girl in the slums in Mumbai, one of our changemaker projects, Arti Naik, and also plants a tree. So, the inks themselves are all organic. Everything is ethically produced and sourced and fairly traded. Everyone involved in the process has been fairly paid. And so that's, I wanted to create that sharing model within the book itself. And I'm not going to tell you that was easy in the publishing industry, because it's just not how the publishing industry works, as many industries don't work in this way. So it really was about finding the right publisher. And initially, Sophie and I had been approached by a different publisher, but they were just not willing to do any of these kinds of additional sustainable aspects to the book that we wanted. And we had to part ways, and went to find, and we found Policy Press, and they've been absolutely phenomenal and supported the book in so many different ways. Even at the beginning of the COVID crisis, Policy Press were able to help expedite a royalty payment to Arti Naik in the slums in Mumbai, so that she could help build her digital school and for girls to continue their education online, so they too could stay safe in their homes, and also being able to deliver food and grain to those slum homes. So, I feel really proud that, we were able to do that. We've been able to help in some small way. And it just goes to show that if businesses, when they're producing these products and services, really start to embed that sharing within their models, there's all kinds of impact that can happen. And sometimes it's, it might be a relatively small contribution, but actually it makes a huge difference in terms of the lives of people that are being, positively impacted, by that sharing that's happening. And so, the book is really, it's about inspiring people to say, well, you too can, be a change maker, and you too can connect and see these incredible stories from around the world.
I just want to reiterate on your points there on the book. So for the purchase of one book, you're planting a tree. So obviously although the paper used is recycled, but you're planting a tree, you're feeding, is it one child in Mumbai?
One girl.
One girl in Mumbai. So planting a tree, feeding one girl in Mumbai, 100% sustainable materials from recycled material, all in one book. Which is just, when we had our conversation before and you told me about that, I didn't realise that was possible, to have a book 100% sustainably created. And just the fact you've managed to not only do that, but plant a tree and feed a girl in Mumbai is just blows my mind.
Feed and educate, because Arti's project, it's an incredible story, but she was living in the slums in Mumbai, one of the largest in Mulund, one of the largest slums in southern Mumbai. And she saw that, essentially there would be no future for her or for any of the girls that were around her. And she wanted to change that, but she didn't want to just change it for herself. She wanted to change it for others. And so she started making necklaces, earning the equivalent of 9 pence a day, to be able to save up to get herself an education, because she realised that in order to set up a school for slum-based girls, which is what she wanted to do, she had to learn English, she had to learn Hindi, because she speaks a local dialect, Marathi. And in India, if you don't speak Hindi or English, you can't access the education system. And so what she did was she started off with the support of her mother, living in this 2-roomed, tiny, I've been there, slum house,
with open sewers and very limited access to clean running water. And she started opening up her home, first of all, to 5 girls that would come each day. And the idea was that she needed to entice them, because why would you come and learn if actually you could be either begging on the streets or finding a way to earn some money, albeit through prostitution or any other means, finding a way to be able to feed yourself, feed your family. And so she knew that she needed to be able to offer them food. That had to be part and parcel of this school. And so that's how she started. And what she did was she appealed to people in the community. And to this day, when those girls go to now she has this small schoolhouse in the slums. And when the girls go to that schoolhouse, they are given a hot meal every single day. For most of them, that's still the only meal they'll get per day. And that is provided by the community, because, people only may be able to donate a certain amount of grain or whatever it might be to make that hot meal. But, cumulatively, they're able to provide that hot meal. And so, that's what Artie's done. She's incredibly resourceful. She managed to, not only did she teach herself English and Hindi, she also managed to tap into various resources. Ashoka, who supports change makers and social entrepreneurs, not just in India, but around the world. Unlimited, they're a foundation for social entrepreneurs, and they have Unlimited India. And Artie was able to tap into those resources and find, and access grants to be able to help her get the support that she needed to make this school a reality. And, it takes so much tenacity. Talk about challenges. She had so many challenges. And just being a girl in that situation, just the way that, girls and women, are treated in those environments. And, her future would have been, she would have been, married, off as a teenager and likely, into prostitution or being sex trafficked. And, for her, that's not what she wanted for herself and not for others. And so she set up the Saki School for Girls. And now she's also teaching their mothers. As of COVID, she set up an online digital school, and she ran an audio storybook initiative where she had girls that had been through her program who'd learned Hindi and English record stories and deliver them to girls in the slums. Absolutely extraordinary. So it just goes to show, if you have that passion and that determination, then so many things are possible. And, one of the things that has come out of the book for me is that I started to identify key traits that change makers have. And I think that's really interesting, because I interviewed about 200 change makers from different parts of the world for the book. And I started to look at, okay, well, what do they have in common? What are these traits that they have? And what you find is that, they're brave. They're all doing something that is about, reinventing the wheel, that is very much going, traveling upstream. These are brave decisions that they're making. So there's absolutely this characteristic of bravery. They're adaptable because they need to be flexible. Things are changing. And one of the things that we've seen during this crisis is that, those people and those businesses and those, initiatives that aren't able to adapt, they just fall by the wayside. So that's really important. Putting love at the heart of your project or your business is also really important, and that's a characteristic that I've seen with these change makers. The passion that they bring to their projects and how they treat other people, with love and with kindness. Again, that's something that we're seeing as part of this changing business landscape. Another characteristic. We're also seeing how these different businesses and change makers they're future facing. They've got their eye on the future. They're thinking about the long term. And of course they're sharing, because that's inevitably it is about who can we partner with, who can we collaborate with. No business can be an island. In this environment that we live in, it's all about being networked. It's all about partnering. It's all about having what I call your collaborative advantage. That's so important now, much more than a competitive advantage, because nobody's doing this alone. So, these are some of the characteristics. And finally, positivity is also a really important characteristic of being a change maker. The belief that you can make change. If Artie didn't think it was possible, even though it was absolutely against the odds, then, how could she have achieved what she did achieve? And I look at some of the other change makers in the book. A woman in Egypt, Imam Bibar's, and she started working with the most impoverished women, working as waste pickers, picking the garbage from landfill. And she realized that these women, she wanted to set up a microcredit loan project so that these women could set up businesses and could have their own independent livelihoods. But then she realised that these women didn't even have identity. They didn't even have any identification. They weren't registered in any way. They were only seen as being, living, breathing human beings if they were married to somebody. So through the man that they were married to, then they existed. If the man left, they didn't exist anymore in terms of the law. And so what she managed to do was she managed to introduce a system of identity cards for these women. And then she started this micro loan project, and it's extraordinary. All of these businesses that have popped up. I mean, not just in Egypt where she's based, but she's worked across the Arab world, and again, just an extraordinary, an absolute force to be reckoned with. And again, these entrepreneurial stories of people, from so many different backgrounds, because one of the things that I wanted to look at with this book were, who are these change makers? Who are these change makers that are building a more caring, sharing economy? Are they from urban environments, rural environments? Is this about age? Is it about gender? Is it about disability? Is it about culture? Is it about religion? Is it about where you are in the world? What are those factors? What are the demographics? I wanted to better understand that. And so that was hence why, I wanted to interview so many different change makers from so many different backgrounds and from, different continents, to really understand that. And ultimately, the findings of the book, little bit of a spoiler alert, I'm afraid, but the findings of the book are really ultimately, look, to share is to be human. And these change makers come from all walks of life, from all demographics, and we have this innate human ability to create change around us if we make the decision to do that. And that in itself is really empowering. Some of the people in this book call themselves, they're like, why do you want to interview me? I'm just an ordinary person. There's this doctor in Greece who set up a network of free clinics to provide medical care for refugees and people who could not access the medical system. And again, she did that, against the odds, against a backdrop of a Greek government that had introduced a new law that meant if you'd been unemployed for longer than 2 years, you no longer had access to medical care. I mean, I'm not really sure what the logic behind that one was, but she said, as a doctor, I can hardly turn people away that need to be cared for. And so she set up this network, and they've taken on abandoned spaces that were buildings that were not being used, surplus buildings, empty abandoned buildings, using medicines that for no good reason would have been sent to landfill. So again, you've got this kind of sharing of resources model that's all part of this. And they set up community kitchens. So actually the clinics themselves not only became places where you could go and you could be healed, but also places where you could connect with other people in your community and find other resources, clothing, food, a conversation. And so it just goes to show, again, the sort of diversity and the huge potential for change making.
There's some really great stories there. Have you had any feedback since the book's come out of people that have been inspired by the book and started their own journey?
Actually, so many of those stories, and that's one of the things that's been really, really heartwarming. During COVID, actually, we were Generation Share was voted top isolation read by Forbes. And I'm really proud of that because, so many people have been in contact, through social media and, about businesses that they've, that have been inspired by this book. And Sophie and I last year, we went on this kind of world tour to launch the book in different countries. And again, I'm glad in many respects that last year was last year and, not this year. Of course, we wouldn't have been able to do this, although we would have found a different way to do it, as I'm saying. But what was interesting about all of those events is that we brought together a network of change makers, and every event that we did, people came up and they said, I'm going to set up a clothing recycling business. I'm going to set up, a food sharing business. I'm going to set up a community project that is working with vulnerable people to help them to access resources that they need. So, really countless new initiatives that have been inspired, because I think, one of the things that I really wanted to do was was to provide people with this opportunity to connect with people. And Sophie's photography is very, very powerful. And one of the comments that that we've had about the photos in the book is this idea that I see myself in these people. These people are familiar to me. That was a comment that we had a few times. These people seem familiar to me. There's something about them. She's very good at, being able to really sort of capture that kind of humanity, through the camera lens, which again is why I wanted this to be a really visual book and for us to have something that, could really resonate with people in a very human way. And the stories themselves, I interviewed people with lots and lots of hours of recordings, and people tell their own stories in their own words. So I've used extracts from those stories, and I've edited those stories and written, in-depth introductions to each of the chapters. Each chapter looks at a different demographic, be that urban, rural, be that about, money, be that about disability, be that about culture and religion. So I've looked at lots of gender and age and so on. And for each of those, I've looked at, what's the research behind this and how do we understand the bigger context. So the sort of, the kind of cultural commentary, if you like, and then people are telling their stories in their words with their beautiful portrait.
It's extraordinary. I think one of the biggest things there, Benita, that stood out to me when you were telling us about these stories, and that it's obviously where you interview 200 people, it's one thing that really stuck out to me is just it's not just these one stories, it's the compounding impact of each of those stories you broke down. So like with Artie, where you're talking, she set up this school and then was able to teach people. So it was her journey herself, and then bringing so many people onto this journey. And where you talk about just sharing, constant sharing and evolving all together. But just when you actually break it down, how many journeys and how many stories are there within that one story? The amount of people that then learned and came on board, and then they started teaching. And it's just mind-blowing that just when people want to work together, when we want to develop and evolve and share and see how we can actually make lives better for everybody, it's just the power there to take that and as a ripple effect and just grow it is extraordinary. And I hope everybody reads this book, because it's just the impact that can have, and when we all put our minds together, it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk about many stories within one story, and that's absolutely true. There's a woman that I interviewed from Kenya called Nanjira Sambuli, and she works in this area of digital equality. She's all about providing equal access to the internet for people from all sorts of impoverished backgrounds. And what she talks about as well is she talks about, as a black woman, visibility. And she says, if I stop showing up, that's one day that door is going to be closed. And she talks about visibility from that point of view and access from that point of view. And, we've seen this year with the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that's been really, coming to the fore in terms of institutionalized racism and, lots of the issues around, prejudice and opportunity. And so this whole idea of access for opportunity, is incredibly important. So within Nanjira's story, again, there are many stories. There's a technology story there, there's a social innovation story there's a story about gender, there's a story about race, there's a story about equality. I mean, there's so many different aspects. So I think you're absolutely right. And people often ask me, well, how did I choose the people that how did I select the people that were going to be in the book? And it was on one level, it was really difficult, because actually for every story that's in the book, there are hundreds of thousands more stories that could have been told. And there's a strong case for many, many other stories that could have been in this book. What I tried to do was have each story be representative of a type of story. And in fact, there's quite a sort of clever key in the book that is sort of subliminally but colour-coded, because each story represents a different aspect of the sharing economy. And at the beginning of the book, there is an infographic that really sets out those different parts of the sharing economy. So you start to be able to see through the book how this comes together as a whole. And so really each story is representative. It's there as a selected representation, but actually there could have been many other stories that are included in the book. And again, it's there. You mentioned the word ripples, and it is there to create. People talked about these ripples of positivity, and that's really what I wanted to create with the book, was this, this inspiration for people to go off and create their own initiatives and to say, you can do it. It's everywhere. Everybody can do this. There's not some kind of, these people don't have some kind of, sort of magic wand, but actually it's within all of us to make this happen. And look, here are some examples of some really wonderful, very, human examples of adversity and people who've actually come through and really created something that is beautiful and special and inspirational, and they're doing that in lots of different ways, and you can do it too. And that's so important to me, that this book is about that. It's about access. It really is about accessibility and knowing that you have it within yourself to become that change maker.
Definitely. I think one thing that just in my mind, and I think people listening, so the amount of inspiration there, and I can't imagine anyone that'd ever read and think, anyway, next book. It's going to have that impact. So for people, what would your advice be to someone that's taken that inspiration and is like, right, I need to do something. I need to take action. I need to make the world a better place. I need to have my mark, have my impact. But then they sit there and go, okay, what am I going to do? What would your advice be in somebody that wants to become their own change maker? How would you advise finding your own purpose, finding that part of your identity that is going to make that change?
I believe it's important for people to start to tap into a network, because wherever people are in the world, there are always other people that you can connect with that want to make changes, that feel compelled to make a difference within their communities. So I think it's about seeking those people out. Organisations in the UK, for example, Unlimited, the Foundation for Social Entrepreneurs, they work with entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs in lots of different ways, and you can go to them where you've got a kind of an inkling of an idea, and they can help you on that journey. The work that I do with entrepreneurs, with social entrepreneurs and people who have concepts, is I take people through a change maker process. So what I'm doing is, from that you might have a nugget of an idea, or in fact you might have something quite well formed, or indeed you might just know, well, I want to do something, but I'm not really sure what. And I take people through those, that process. Now, one of the kind of downsides of there are obviously many downsides of the pandemic, but was that Sophie and I were all set up to start running these change maker retreats, which were, weekends. We had the first one that was originally booked in to be happening in this month, in September. It would have been a couple of weekends ago. And of course, that hasn't happened for all the obvious reasons. However, I'm looking at next year at ways in which I'm going to run those weekends. But the idea being that people come for this experience of unleashing their inner change maker. And so you come to the weekend, it's not about already coming with an idea, but it's just a sense of you want to change something, you want to do something, and taking people through this process to be able to unleash that and enable that to happen. So that's something that I'm going to be running next year. And currently the work I do with entrepreneurs is very much, obviously, we're doing this all virtually, and that is really taking people through a process. And the people that I'm currently working with are people who have an idea. It could be a kind of inkling. I've got one entrepreneur in Portugal who's at super early stages, who has got a sort of a nugget of an idea that's not at all fully formed. But what we're doing is going through a process to really draw that out and really better understand why he wants to do what he wants to do and what that thing actually is, and then actually turn it into a really viable proposition that that actually can have legs and a life of its own. So that's really the work that I do, is to take people through that change maker process. But I would say anybody anywhere can tap into a local network. There will always be organisations, community groups, meetup groups, whatever it might be. There are so many places that we can congregate online where you can find like minds. There used to be a group in Brighton called Like Mind, where people used to meet in a cafe every Thursday morning, and it was just about bringing together like minds, people that wanted to make a difference in the world. And you could just go along and have a conversation, or you could go along and develop an idea, or you could go along and connect with someone else to be able to develop that idea. So I think there's lots of different ways in which that can happen, but the key thing is to know that it's possible, that you can do it.
And just to get out there, talk to people. If you've got no idea, all of the ideas, or whatever it is, just talk and just bounce ideas between people. You never know what you can get from sharing.
Absolutely.
you've given us so much to go on, so much to think about, and just what a journey you've come on and the amount of impact you've had, and just extraordinary story, and thank you for giving your time. On the topic of benevolent business and making the world a better place, one thing I always like to ask to end on is just, what is one thing that occurs within humanity right now that you hope will one day be eradicated?
One thing that occurs that I want to be eradicated.
Mm-hmm.
See, you're asking the positive woman here, because I always like to look at actually what's the one thing that I want to be developed, what's the one thing that I want to really, and that's of course for me it's all about sharing resources.
Okay, that's
what do I
part
want
one.
to be what do I want to be eradicated? I want poverty to be eradicated.
Poverty.
If I'm going to pick one thing, it's going to be poverty. You know, poverty creates so many problems, and you know, along with that, of course, and wrapped in with, you know, with poverty is of course, you know, the climate crisis, because we know that exacerbates poverty and that creates more poverty. So I think for me, if I've got to pick one thing, but of course I would always prefer to focus on the positive and to say that, you know, the thing that I would like to grow and to be really dominant is sharing, is that, you know, we are able to access shared resources, that we can eradicate poverty, and you know, we can eradicate hunger, and we can eradicate the climate crisis through the sharing of human resources and build a more caring, sharing economy. So I think for me that's got to be the way it's framed.
Thank you for putting such a positive twist onto it. I like it. And again, thank you, Benita, for taking your time and coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, an absolute honour, and again, thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
So there we have it. Thank you again, Benita, for coming on. If you're interested in purchasing Generation Share, then you can check out the link in the description for the podcast below.
Okay, so what was your biggest takeaway from that interview?
I think from that, and discussing with Benita and all around this sharing culture, it sort of has imprinted on my mind, where I think of the modern world and how we're all connected more so with technology, especially over social media. You start to find different groups and pages that you like, and you start to build up these different networks of these, I don't know, micro niches around. And it's that reassurance that these different values that, well, for me personally, these different values and ethoses that I've developed over the last few years around the environment, sustainability, and thinking of what can be repurposed, reused, instead of seeing it as waste that's to go in the bin, is that there is this huge community committed to exactly that. They're committed to repurposing, they're committed to sharing, and they're committed to, and it's not always just about saving a few quid. It's about this whole philosophy of how wasteful we are as a species, and it's about trying to reduce that as much as possible to the point that we minimise our waste in landfill. And I think it's huge just to think that what I thought was just a few groups on Facebook here and there and a few little niche communities is actually a big community full of different bits, where you've got a point where you've got authors writing books to it, you've got companies all dedicated to it, and that's the whole premise of this podcast, that it is actually already quite established, and it's opened my eyes massively.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a bit of a leg up on me because you've already got the book, and we're going to talk a bit more about that next week. But I like how many stories there are to tell, and I think it'd be really good to get some of these people on as guests in the podcast in the future. And so if there's anyone listening that is featured in a book, or if you are inspired by some of the things we've been talking about and you know people that do a similar thing, then please get in contact. And how can they do that?
So they can do that by emailing me directly at hayden.bloomfield@hotmail.com, or they can get in touch through socials, whether that's the Facebook page or on Instagram, or via ourselves, Dave or myself, on LinkedIn. You can find socials, it's Benevolent Business Podcast. But also, if you can leave any feedback, any comments, good or bad, let us know your thoughts. And if you could review us on Facebook, that would be amazing. Thank you guys, until next week.
See you next week.